James, after the Soviet bloc ended, after it disintegrated into separate countries, NATO expanded eastwards. It expanded to incorporate East Germany in a new unified Germany, but it also incorporated the Baltic states and a number of Central European states. There are now NATO troops right on the Russian border. It seems very much like we're back to a Cold War posture. Does NATO see Russia as a major threat?
Well, at the time that NATO was enlarging and decided this in the 1990s, the goal was to try to expand what had been created in the West in terms of democracy, market economy, rule of law to the East. And there was an attempt to try to have a good relationship with Russia at the same time. The Clinton-Yeltsin efforts to create a NATO-Russia, this thing called the Permanent Joint Council, which has become the NATO-Russia Council, to try to keep the two countries and to keep NATO and Russia in a good relationship despite enlargement. I mean, remember, enlargement wasn't forced on the Central and Eastern Europeans. They wanted in. They wanted into the West, and they did want protection in case Russia became aggressive again. It's only really since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 that NATO has taken a more aggressive posture toward Russia. And just think if the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, think if they hadn't come into NATO. Think what they would be dealing with right now with Russia that had invaded Ukraine and they weren't in NATO to be protected. So this really has, the issue between NATO and Russia is much more recent, and the 1990s were a very different period.
Let me get Alexander's view on that. Alexander, Russia has complained about the NATO expansion eastwards, and Russia says, in fact, that NATO broke a promise that it would not expand beyond incorporating East Germany into the alliance. What do you make of what James just said?
Well, I totally disagree with this, because to say that Russia invaded Ukraine is absolute rubbish. The West has orchestrated a coup in Ukraine. It got rid of a legitimate government that was accepted by the European Union and the world at large. And this is absolutely preposterous to accuse Russia of invading Ukraine. What we must understand is that NATO is an anti-Russian military alliance. To say that NATO included Eastern European countries and the Baltics to spread democracy is absolutely outrageous. NATO has nothing to do with democracy. NATO has nothing to do with the free market. NATO is a racket run by the Americans. And NATO, once you become a member, you do not decide what you do. Brussels decides what you do. You buy American arms or European arms. Your policy is being controlled by Brussels, but basically by Washington. So all this, nonsense about how democracy was spreading with NATO and the European Union. We saw it in Ukraine. We saw what is happening now on the borders of Russia, where NATO maneuvers are taking place. So no, this propaganda will not be bought anymore. And once the West has interfered in Ukraine, and once the West has positioned its troops in Ukraine, there is no trust anymore between Russia and the West. And until the West gets out of Ukraine, and until it stops those provocations, those military, maneuvers and so on, and until it stops meetings like the one we had last Saturday in Munich, where absolute blatant lies were said about Russia, when no proof was given, there will be no cooperation between Russia and the West. None. Zero.
Okay, let me get Paul's view on this. Paul, what do you make of these renewed hostilities between the NATO members and Russia?
Well, certainly I think that there was a point in the 90s where the Cold War had ended and there was a possibility to unite Europe under, as Mikhail Gorbachev put it, one European house. And in order for that to have happened, NATO should have been dissolved, and they should have come up with a pan-European security agreement. This didn't happen. At the same time, after that, Russia left its democratic path and started becoming increasingly authoritarian. Vladimir Putin's policies have been neo-imperialistic policies, and with the invasion of the Ukraine and the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, things have changed. And so there's no more possibility of a all-European security agreement, which would be most preferable. Now again, we have two camps. But we might even have more than two camps. And when we see that there are frictions between the United States and Turkey in northern Syria. So there's another rift there. I wouldn't call it simply East versus West again. Things are much more complex than that now.
Well, I do think these other rifts are incredibly important. And you had Secretary Tillerson visiting Turkey and trying to repair to some extent, but it's still very clear that there are huge differences between the United States and Turkey over what's going on in Syria, and especially with respect to the Kurds in Syria as well as the Kurds in Iraq. And so, this is quite a difficult situation. And we also see divisions within Europe, France and Germany, which are really continuing to promote the European Union as a group of liberal democracies, and countries like Poland and Hungary that are moving in a more authoritarian direction. This is very dangerous for the European Union going forward.
Okay, let's get the view from Turkey. Let's go to Metin in Istanbul. And Metin, Turkey, of course, is an important member of NATO on its southeastern flank. Turkey also allows the United States to use its air base at Incirlik. But there's a poll that you have actually cited in one of your reports in which you say that only 7.5% of Turks are in favor of deepening cooperation with NATO. What in Turkey is driving the anti-NATO sentiment?
This is a very good question, and I will suggest that right now the Turkish case and the bilateral ties between Turkey and NATO is a good test case to understand and to question NATO's relevancy in the global security environment. And as you said, we have a sort of getting increasingly visible trust deficit between NATO and Turkey. And by saying Turkey, I'm including policymakers, the generals within the military, and also the Turkish society, particularly Turkish society. We see a sort of decreasing popular support for NATO. It's around 20% at the moment. NATO has been right now being challenged by the new threats as we talk, the non-state, violent non-state actors. And I would criticize NATO's efforts for transformation, which are primarily on a material side of the story. What we need is a sort of new policy-making mechanisms in NATO. What we need is a sort of new military-civilian integrations. And then NATO should be much more an actor that should really care about public diplomacy side of the story, and with a sort of holistic approach. And not only the member states, NATO should look for solutions to those global threats in a sort of global fashion. So that's why the policy-making side of the story is extremely important for NATO to be relevant, much more relevant in the new security environment.
And talking about that, James, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently talked about what the alliance was doing in Iraq. Let's listen to part of what the Secretary General had to say.
We will also plan to help the Iraqi forces becoming increasingly professional by establishing specialized military academies and schools. We are planning to scale up NATO's presence, and we are not planning for a combat mission.
So troops will not be involved in actual fighting, in direct combat, but will be involved in training. Is that what NATO has become now?
Well, NATO's become a lot of different things, again, partly because there's just no other institution like it. But on this issue that was just raised about non-NATO partners, I mean, this is something that NATO has been doing for quite some time now. Partners like Australia, Japan, South Korea, but also partners in the Middle East. When NATO went into Libya and the operation there, you had several Middle Eastern countries part of that operation. And the operation in Afghanistan that came about to try to create stability after the early 2000s and the initial war, that force had countries from all over the world participating in that reconstruction and stabilization effort. So NATO has done a lot to try to create these global partnerships, because the threats to the NATO members, the Europeans, the United States, Canada, those threats are global threats, so it needs global partners.
Alexander, has NATO, in your view, appropriated to itself the right to intervene anywhere in the world, whatever the reason may be? It may be humanitarian, it may be that it's emulating the US position of preemption. What do you make of NATO's new role?
Well, first of all, I think NATO failed in every area and every conflict outside Europe because it was never designed to be an international military alliance. If we look at Afghanistan, it's a total disaster. This is the biggest producer of opium now. It happened under NATO, and the NATO couldn't train the Afghan troops properly, so they can't really fight the Taliban. The Taliban controls 2/3 of the country. NATO has basically failed completely. What we've seen in Libya was a total disaster, with NATO forces basically causing such mayhem that nobody yet knows the consequences of that and what is going to happen. NATO is failing in Syria as well, although they're giving wonderful reports how they're battling ISIS. If we look at any of the cities they've tried to so-called liberate from ISIS, they basically destroyed them, razed them to the ground. They cannot fight properly. They cannot teach the armies properly. In Iraq, when they so-called taught the Iraqi army, they ran off the moment ISIS, about 200 of them, took over Mosul. All the Iraqi soldiers and officers simply ran away. So NATO is useless as a training institution. It can't fight properly, it can't train. So the only thing it can do, basically, is get those countries of Eastern Europe and others into the bloc and then force them to buy European-made and American-made arms. As a diplomat, NATO is useless as well because it's a military alliance. Military people don't talk. Military people only shoot, and they want bigger budgets to buy more weapons. So again, it is absolutely useless.
Okay, James, is that a problem for NATO? It gets involved in places like Afghanistan or in Libya, but there's not much thought given to, let's say, the day after.
Well, in Afghanistan, you remember, the United States went to war initially. It was not a NATO operation. It was to go after the al-Qaeda groups that were in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden had planned the attacks on the United States.
But the US did invoke Article 5.
Well, no, it was actually the European countries that invoked Article 5, but the United States, the Bush administration initially decided not to make it a NATO operation. And then when they went to war in Iraq, they then asked NATO to create this International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, to help rebuild Afghanistan. And it's not, so NATO has struggled with that. But could anyone have done that? No. And on the Libya issue, the United Nations, including Russia, authorized NATO to go into Libya to protect the population of Benghazi. It is the case that NATO then expanded the operation and produced regime change there, and was not then there for the post-conflict situation. But neither was anybody else. And so this notion that NATO is a total failure, it's had its successes. For example, ending the war in Bosnia and preventing massacre of Kosovar Albanians in the 1990s, and it's also had its failures, like any institution.
But I think we can agree that the situation in Libya, for instance, is not stable.
Right, and that was NATO, that conducted the war, and there was no planning after. But even when you have a situation where you might have planning after, it's still going to be a difficult situation. So the challenge again globally is that there is no other institution like NATO. So it keeps getting called upon to act in these types of situations. There's nobody else to call on. The UN can't do it. The UN authorized NATO in Libya in 2011.
Paul, NATO itself is facing some internal issues. We heard during the United States election campaign, even after President Trump took office, his complaints that NATO's European partners were depending too much on the United States. They were getting a free ride, he said, when it comes to their common defense. He's called on NATO members to increase their defense spending. How have NATO members responded to that?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is all very curious. As you mentioned, when Trump came to power and when he first visited Europe as well, he was playing down America's commitment to NATO. He was talking a lot about almost giving the Europeans an ultimatum that they had to increase their defense budgets or else. It did not seem like they were committed, that the United States was committed. This America First vision of President Trump is playing out in NATO and security policy as well. So you have a very different situation now where Mattis comes to Europe and is telling the Europeans that they have to increase their defense spending, but also giving them an ultimatum that unless they sign some kind of piece of paper that says that NATO and not the European Union will be solely in charge of all defense efforts, then what? It's unclear exactly what would happen, but this ultimatum has been given to the Europeans. So you've got here like a 180-degree Trump flip-flop again, and we don't know really where we stand. As for the defense budgets themselves, they have increased about 5% in recent years. But many countries, including Germany, isn't close to the total budget, this military budget being 2% of its total budget, and the new government is coming into power. It does not have that, does not set that as a priority either. So it doesn't really seem like President Trump's challenges to Europe to increase their defense budgets have really done much at all.
That's where we're going to have to leave it. We have run out of time. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.